Welcome to the Linguist Lab. Most of you probably know I'm Kevin. Mostly, well, if you don't know, my name is right there. So we are doing these labs to, try to promote linguistics and the study of the biblical languages. So we're going to be looking at really how to go about studying the verbal systems. So we're not going to be, I don't know who is familiar with the podcast we've been doing. So right now we're finishing up a series on the verbal system, or on the verbal systems, Greek and Hebrew. So we just did our fourth episode. Our concluding one on Hebrew just came out yesterday. The concluding one on Greek will come out about a week from now. And so that will give you kind of a good idea of, some of the bigger issues. But I wanted to take some time here to really dig in and see, like, how do you go about doing linguistics, and particularly semantics on the verbal system, really on any verbal system, because I think it's important. A lot of times your theory and your method often determines the outcome. And so I think it's pretty crucial that we develop tools on how to do this. So that's what we're going to be doing. So this is going to be really interactive. So I also don't know where you guys are at, what your background is. I have no clue, right? So I'm going to assume that you're at least somewhat familiar with the terminology. We're going to go over the terms again because it doesn't hurt to do it again. But if you aren't familiar, and if you feel like, oh wow, this is just so much information, we are going to have a recording of this, and we'll probably post it somewhere on YouTube or something. And I would just encourage you to go back and listen to our podcast episodes, especially the first one where I talked to Nora about Nora Bonet, linguist at Hebrew University, just about like the basic categories. So I think that's pretty important for just like getting your head around, what we're talking about. So that being said, let's just jump into it. So I will say, if you have questions, just jump in, ask questions. I would like to keep moving, so we can get to all the things we have planned, but and there will be a time at the end for questions. So if you have like bigger picture questions, it might be better to wait till the end. And my plan is basically to talk, for, I don't know, 20 minutes or so on theory and like a case study on English, 20 minutes on Greek and 20 minutes on Hebrew, something like that. And so, like I said, you can jump in and ask questions, but we will have time for that at the end as well. So let me just share my screen here. I'm going to just present a PowerPoint. Okay. So just a little bit about me in case you don't really know who I am. Hopefully I'll have my PhD soon. I'm getting ready to turn it in. Hopefully this month or the next. And so it's from Hebrew University. Been studying in the linguistics department. My degree will technically be in Hebrew. And so I've written on the biblical Hebrew verbal system, and basically work on all things verbs, and I mean really lots of things, really semantics and syntax, mostly semantics. Founded Biblingo. So I studied the biblical languages at the Police Institute in Jerusalem. So that's where I learned to really speak Greek and Hebrew. And I already said I studied linguistics at Hebrew University and Dallas International University. So here's what we're doing. We're going to first talk about how to do semantics. And that'll basically be like, okay, how do we apply semantic theory to really any sort of morpheme we want to analyze? and then we'll do a case study in English. So I think it's really important to look at English first. If you can't analyze English, then you cannot analyze a language that you are not a native speaker in. so that's just how it works. And I think a lot of people within biblical studies would do well to take a step back, look at their own system, and see how that's functioning first. So that's what we're going to do. Then we're going to look at a particular phenomenon in biblical Greek. Look at how achievements behave with different aspects, and then we'll look at the participle in biblical Hebrew. So both of these are designed, again, they're not supposed to be like, oh, this is the most interesting question we could ask about these systems. Some of these questions we tackle in the podcast, right? Or, I mean, I have a lot in my thesis that you could look at if you want to know my thoughts on it. But these are designed to say, hey, like, how do we go about doing analyses? And then we'll have Q&A at the end. So let me, hold on, captions. Okay, I just realized that I don't have my speaker notes. Okay, speaker notes, great. Okay, so doing semantics. So I think we mentioned this or in the podcast I had with Nora. So we talked about developing these sort of notional categories and like, how do we go about analyzing a language, right? So we talked about developing notional categories first. And so that was tense, aspect, modality, to say the least. There's actually, lots of other things we could look at, but those are kind of the big three when it comes to verbal systems. And then we talked about going to the data to gather facts. So we need to have facts about how these verb forms are actually interpreted, right? Basically, our analysis is taking into consideration, or has taken into consideration, all these facts. A good analysis will account for all of them, right? With a meaning for these verb forms. And then we will apply these notional categories, right? So we have some idea of the notional categories, tense, aspect, modality. We look at the facts of a particular language, and then we apply those notional categories to the data. And the idea is that we would cover all the data. If we don't, right? Like, let's say there's a sector, of certain verb forms that we don't really know what they're doing. We need to, come up with some sort of story for why that's the case, right? And then we refine our notional categories, right, based on that leftover data, based on, the data we've looked at, and then we repeat, right? So that's the idea. So when we talk about these notional categories, these are the ones that you should be familiar with if you're going to do any sort of serious work on a verbal system. So tense, aspect, action, modality, verbal mood, sentential mood. You could easily spend the rest of your life studying the literature on this. It's very, very vast. It's night for me. So I'll say tonight. So tonight we'll just look at tense, aspect, and action, because we just don't have a ton of time to get into the others. So, and those are honestly probably the simplest. So let's start out with just a primer on tense, if you're not familiar with what tense is. So tense is a notional category. So sometimes tense is used to talk about like a tense form. So basically, people use the word tense to refer to a specific morphological form. That's not how we're using it here, right? I'll always say form. So tense here is a certain temporal relationship, and it's specifically the relationship between the speech time and the reference time. So this is a simplified definition. There will be, again, if you read the literature on tense, like there's a lot more to it than this. But this is the basic idea, that that we can define certain relationships between when we are uttering a sentence and the time about which we are talking, right? So that's the basic relationship. So I think in the example that Nora and I discussed, we said something like, I don't know, Tom ate dinner, and that eating dinner event refers to a specific time in the past, not just any time in the past, but a specific time in the past. So we're referring to a specific time, and we know it's past in the sense that it precedes, that temporal interval precedes the speech time. Okay, so aspect is the temporal relationship between the reference time and event time. Okay, so the time that we're talking about, and which is the reference time, right? And the actual event time, taking place in the real world. So we can think of different kinds of relationships, different logical relationships between these two intervals. So again, you can think about them actually just in terms of like real time intervals. So we can think about like from 4 to 5, right? If you read a book, let's say we're talking about the time span 4 to 5. If you read a book between 4:15 and 4:45, that's perfective, right? Because your reading of the book, that event in the real world took place within the time that we're talking about, right? If we're talking about 4 to 5, and you read a book between 3:45 and 5:15, then the time that we're talking about does not include all of the event that took place in the real world, right? So in English, the contrast between these two is often expressed with, I read the book between 4 and 5, or I was reading the book between 4 and 5. So that's how we would morphologically distinguish between those two notional categories in English. Okay, so, and again, we can think of other relationships, like the perfect, for example, has the event time preceding the reference time. It's just another. We're not really going to talk about the perfect tonight. We will talk about it on the Greek podcast if you want to hear more about that. I mean, I talked a little bit about it on the Hebrew one as well, which came out yesterday. So that's the perfect. And next we have action start. So action start is a category that is basically it's the temporal structure of the event time. I'm wondering how much to get into how it's defined within particularly biblical Greek studies. I mean, I'll just say that if you go to Wikipedia and look up action start, that definition will not match up with the many scholars in biblical Greek. And Wikipedia is normally right, and in this case, they are, in the sense that they are reflecting how linguists use that term. Yeah, I don't want to get into exactly what the nuanced differences are right here. If you have a question about that, we can talk about it at the end. But for us, what's important is that we can think of events in different kinds of ways, right? So we can think of, for example, a state. States are durative, right? They don't. They're extended in time. So like love, right? It's not necessarily. It's not like punctual. It doesn't have a natural endpoint. So there's no like necessary ending to, loving my wife, right? It just goes on, and there's no. I mean, it might end, right? Any of these sort of situations could theoretically have an endpoint, but there's no natural ending to it. Contrast that with something like build a house, right? So building a house has a natural endpoint where, once the house is built, then that is the end of that building a house event. And then dynamic, right? Is there change happening? So again, something like love doesn't have any like sort of change happening with that that event, which is why we don't call it an event. Actually, we call it a state. So I will say that the sort of cover term for these, for like all kinds of events, is eventuality. So if I use that term, that's what that means. Then we have activity. So an activity is a durative event, and it is not telic. So think of something like play basketball, right? In play basketball, it's durative, right? There is time associated with it, but there's no like natural endpoint to playing basketball, right, by yourself. Like it's just, you just keep going and whatever. And then dynamic, right? There is like actual change in the world, but there's no endpoint. And then we have accomplishment. So I mentioned this earlier. Build a house. It is durative, right? You build a house over a certain amount of time. It's telic. There is a natural endpoint when the house is built, and it's dynamic. There is change associated with it as the process unfolds. I will say all of this, it's not necessarily, you really shouldn't think about these categories as encoded in a certain verb. Okay, you should think of them as really as the whole verb phrase. Okay, so basically what that includes the object. So when I said play basketball, there is, it's not telic. But if I said play a basketball game, that is telic, right? Because there is an endpoint to that. So there are tests for this, for what makes something telic and what makes something not telic. But what's important is that it's not just a matter of the verb. Okay. And finally, we have achievement. So achievement is not durative. And so it's something like break, right? Something like break happens instantaneously. 1 second, it's not broken, and then in the next second, there is a different state in the object. It's telic, right? That change in state is an endpoint, is a natural endpoint, and it's dynamic in the sense that something changes, right? So these are really important categories that we will be discussing later on. Okay, so what we need to do, right, when we go, let's just go back really quick to what we're doing here. So we just developed our notional categories, right? So now we have an idea. Okay, what are we talking about when we talk about verbal systems, and how can we analyze them? So now we go to the data and we gather facts. So what kind of facts are we looking for is the question. There are certain facts that are relevant for analyzing a verbal form, right? And here I'm focusing on, as the forms as spectral value, just because it's probably one of the most debated in Greek and Hebrew, what these forms mean especially, and I think it's a category that is actually heavily encoded in English, despite the fact that many people say, oh, English is more tense based. That's just not true. But it has this sort of like mysticism associated with it. I think because it's just easier to think of tense for people, just because it's simpler. But we're going to focus more on forms of spectral value. So let's think about some of these questions, right? So first of all, we need to ask, like, what is the range of temporal interpretations of the form? And so when I'm saying temporal, I mean, I'm including aspect in that, right? Because it's just a temporal relationship. So what is the range of the temporal interpretation? So we just need to go through the different kinds of examples and just see, okay, is the endpoint reached or not in this example? Yes or no, right? Or, first of all, we need to ask, for this verb and its object, is there an endpoint, right? And then is it reached with this particular verb form, right? So those are two different questions we really need to answer. We can talk about, is it past, present, or future? So this is just literally just amassing, data and information about what these forms are actually doing. Okay. And then we can think of like, what kinds of adverbials does it co-occur with? So an example of this, in like the standard test for whether a verb is telic or atelic is, or a predicate, is whether it combines with in adverbials or for adverbials. So I'll give an example. I can say I played basketball for 3 hours. And that works totally fine. It's very odd to say I built a house, or it is more odd. More odd to say I built a house for 3 hours, right? Like when you think, you built a house, if you say I built a house in 3 hours, right? It's the in 3 hours gives you the end point, right? When the house was actually finished, right? So there's actually debate on this for adverbial, like, do English speakers accept I built a house for 3 hours? And there's some people say yes, some people say no. But the point is that with something like play basketball, it's totally fine. And I played basketball in 3 hours is very odd, if not just outright ungrammatical. But with telic predicates, like build a house, in works better than for. So again, this is the kind of adverbials does it co-occur with. And then we have like, what sorts of discourse functions does it have? Like in narrative, for example. So some forms are used, for sequential types of events, or, like background events. And there's generally accepted like patterns for this cross-linguistically. Like if you look at a large number of languages, some forms will be more prone to do one thing in narrative, for example, and other forms will be prone to do other things. And then finally, how does the form behave with different kinds of predicates? So let's take, a particular kind of predicate, like an achievement or a state, and then just run it through and see all the different interpretations we get with that verb form, right? And see, okay, how does this verb form interact with the active insert? And that's actually really, really important for determining the aspectual value of the form. And that's one of the things we'll be discussing with Greek especially. Okay, so let me just go back again. We gathered the facts, right? So develop notional categories, gathering facts. We talked about the kinds of facts that we gather. Now we should apply the notional categories to the data. So what does that look like? So first of all, you can just ask, like, what notional categories fit most easily. So if you have a form that is only found in the past, right? It's never found in the present, never found in the future, then it's a pretty good hypothesis to say, oh, this is past, right? It almost always doesn't work out that way. But those are the kinds of questions we're asking here. So, what notional categories fit most easily? I should say here as well. If I said this form is past, it's always found in the past, that tells me, in and of itself, it tells me nothing about its aspect, right? So then it's another question to ask, what sort of aspect might it have, right? There, a form can be past imperfective, past perfective, past perfect, right? So we can have all kinds of aspectual notions with that form. And so it doesn't like exhaust the analysis, right? To just say it's past. And then is there leftover data? So when we think about leftover data, we're thinking about data that is difficult for our notional category to like fit onto. Okay, so I'll give an example in English. Let's say the present tense. So present tense, just across languages is quite tricky, because it's usually used in all kinds of ways that isn't like ways that aren't so present, right? So normally we think of present as just very simple, and we defined it very simply, right? Speech time and reference time overlap. The time we're talking about is the present. Sorry, I should mention this side note. If you have been using Biblingo, or if you've heard other terms for like speech time, reference time, and event time, the other ones that are common in linguistics are topic time, which is the equivalent to reference time, speech time, which is equivalent to like time of utterance, and event time, which is time of situation. So I'm just using in Biblingo, I use those terms because I just like them better. But they mean the same thing. But yeah, so in the podcast series, we've been using the other terms, so I've just been using those. So that's close parentheses now. So the question is, right, with this leftover data, are there syntactic or semantic commonalities between this leftover data, right? So when we look at so I was talking about the present, right? So when we look at the present in English, it does weird things. So I can say something like, the year is 1948. Or no, let's say the year is 1939. Pearl Harbor has just been bombed, right? So when we hear that, we have no problem interpreting it, right? We don't think like, you're not talking about the present, right? You shouldn't be using present because like clearly the year is not 1939, and Pearl Harbor has not just been bombed, right? But we allow for this, especially within narrative, right? This sort of like transporting of the like deictic center is what it's called, right? Back into a time that's in the past, right? So we don't bat an eye at this, and we do the same thing, like the historical present in English. I mean, if you look at the range of uses of temporal interpretations of the English present tense, you will be shocked. But all that to say, that's the kind of thing where we have to ask ourselves, okay, how do we account for this data, right? If our notional category doesn't quite match up with what the data says, then we really have two options, right? So this is 2BI right now. We can either modify the notional category. So if we did that, right, then what we can say is something like, this polysemy. So we can say, oh, well, this form is present tense and it's past tense, right? Or we can come up with some sort of more abstract meaning, right? So we can say, well, maybe the speech time needs to change. Our definition of speech time needs to change. So maybe it's not exactly like when this utterance is being uttered, like right now by this particular speaker in his like, objective time, but maybe it's more subjective, or maybe it's not speech time at all. Maybe it's just we can just say it's like some sort of like temporal anchor at some point, right? So when we say the year is 1939, 1939 then acts as our temporal anchor, and we can revolve the whole story around that time, and that is the present, right, in a story. So the point is, we might need to modify these notional categories, and that's what people have done. For example, for the present tense or tense in general, they've said, it's not really speech time. It's something more abstract, the temporal anchor or something else. And then we can also say, though, another option is, instead of modifying the notional categories, we can just say that the interpretations are coming from something other than the verb. So we can just say, hey, this isn't about the verb. And so we don't need to change our definition of the verb. It's how the verb interacts with the context in a particular way. So we'll take a look at how this plays itself out in our case studies. So a very important point. This process needs to be repeated. So this is what I said. Again, we'll just go back here one last time. Develop notional categories, go through the data to gather facts, apply the notional categories to the data, attempt to account for the leftover data, and then refine notional categories or look at the context, and then repeat. So I should just say, probably the smartest, just like raw smartest teacher I've ever had at Hebrew University, just like, did his PhD at MIT in linguistics. So in case you didn't know, like MIT has the best linguistics department in the world. And he's just like brilliant guy. I remember he started our syntax and semantics class, and he said, all of our theories are wrong. Like they're all approximations. Like we're always just like close to covering all the data. But we just like most of the time, I mean, he said never. I think he would probably take it back, right? If he knew I was quoting him all the time like this. But the point is this, is that we need to be constantly going through this loop of looking at data and looking at notional categories and refining, because it's just something that if your analysis isn't changing, over years, then there's probably a problem, right? You're probably like not taking into account all the different interpretations. Or I mean, you can come to a legitimately like comprehensive analysis. But I would just say that there's almost always more to discover. So that's the point. Okay, so now we're going to look at English past tense. So, like I said, so let me just ask: are there any questions at this point about what we've discussed so far? I know we went pretty quickly through tense and aspect. Okay, so I will assume that everyone has it, or you'll ask questions at the end. Okay, so the English past tense. So the question is, what is the aspectual value? So let's just assume past tense is correct, right? Like the ed morpheme in English means reference time precedes speech time. So our question is the English past tense perfective or imperfective? Anyone have any thoughts? All native English speakers, I presume.
I think it's both, isn't it? You've got examples of I played football, I was playing football, I used to play football. You've got like a habitual past.
So just the simple that's actually a really important data point, right? That it can combine with other aspectual forms, right? But I'm thinking of just like I played football.
Right.
Any thoughts on that? I played football, I built a house, whatever.
Looks like someone suggested perfective in the chat. Perfective.
Okay. So that is what it's normally called. And there are reasons why people think that. I'll argue for something different here, and I'll tell you why. So let's just go through some facts, right? These are like very bare minimal facts. Okay. Mary ran to the store. Mary was at the store. Mary ate at the store. Mary arrived at the store. Mary built a store. Okay. So here we have some different predicates. So this is the kind of thing we want to look for. If we're going to try to figure out what kind of aspectual interpretation comes along with this form, we need to look at different kinds of predicates in preferably minimal pairs. So this is what we have. So Mary ran to the store. So this is a telic predicate, right? Mary ran to the store in 3 minutes, right? So in 3 minutes tells us that it's telic, and we've reached the end point, right? When we say Mary ran to the store, we understand this as Mary actually arrived at the store. This is different than Mary was running to the store, right? Which is, Crystal, what you said. With that form in particular, we don't know that Mary made it, right? Mary was running to the store when she had to stop because ice cream was on sale and she bought some and went home, right? I don't know, whatever. So Mary ran to the store usually means that she made it. So this is a perfective interpretation, right? So that's a crucial data point, right? We have a telic predicate with a perfective interpretation. Okay. Mary was at the store. So this is another data point. So Mary was at the store is a state, and it doesn't actually tell us, if she's still there, or there is a sort of like implicature. Implicature meaning a meaningful element that, conversational implicature in this case, like a meaningful element that can be canceled. So there is an implicature that she's no longer there. So Mary was at the store, but if I said something like, "Where was Mary 10 minutes ago?" I can say Mary was at the store, and in fact, I think she's still there, right? So I can cancel that, right? I can say, she's still there, which means that this and so go ahead.
Is it kind of open-ended? It's not clear.
Exactly. That's the crucial point. Is that with Mary was at the store, it's the interpretation can be either, right? And it depends on the context. So it can be this perfective interpretation where it's like Mary was at the store and she's no longer there, or it can be this sort of imperfective interpretation where it's Mary was at the store and she might still be there, right? So that's the crucial point. Whereas with Mary ran to the store, you really can't say Mary ran to the store and she's still running there, right? That's just bad, because if Mary ran to the store, she's already there. She can't still be running there. Mary ate at the store. So again, this behaves exactly like B, right? Mary ate at the store. Okay, so what was Mary doing? What did Mary do at the store? She ate at the store, and in fact, I think she's still eating at the store, right? That's totally fine. Mary arrived at the store. So again, B and C are data points that suggest like imperfective. Mary arrived at the store. She has to actually get there, right? And Mary built a store. The store has to be finished being built. So all of this data, right, is like the facts are that we have different aspectual interpretations with this past tense form, right? So the issue is, how do we account for this, right? Particularly if we just compare B and E. So B is a state and E is an accomplishment. This is where we would expect to see contrast. If you had a like truly perfective form, right? A perfective requires that the event time, right? We see it. Event time is included within reference time. So if it's a state, then we have to say that Mary was at the store means that she is no longer there, or we have to come up with some sort of story on why why we get this interpretation. So my sort of suggestion, and my suggestion, this, I'm not the first person to suggest this, but is to say that examples B and E actually mean that the actionsart, right, of the predicate is determining our interpretation and not the verb form, right? This is the crucial point. So it's not the verb form, it's not the past tense in English that's determining how we are interpreting these sentences, right? Because the past tense is the same throughout, right? What's changing is the actionsart, right? Whether it's a state, whether it's an accomplishment, et cetera, right? So in the predicate in B is a state and in E is an accomplishment. And basically what I would say with the English past tense is that the aspectual interpretation comes from actionsart differences, right? Basically, it says that the past tense will just accept whatever actionsart is found in the verb or in the predicate, and then just feed it to us in our interpretation, right? So it's not saying anything about aspect. And in fact, that's how I don't really know how to say this guy or even girl. I don't know if it's a guy or a girl. Archie 2014 or Arch RK, I don't know. this is what they say. This is what they call imperfective, right? They say imperfective is just give me the properties, give me the actionsar properties of the predicate, and I'll feed it. I'll interpret you in that way, right? So that's the idea. So what he or she said was, let's just redefine our notional category, right? That was the solution to imperfective, right? Let's give a new definition for imperfective. And I think actually that makes sense for a lot of reasons, but we don't really have time to get into that. So next, let's look at just the English past tense with one really quick thing, and then we'll move on to Greek. So we have new facts here. So this is an example of how other meaningful elements can determine what we how we understand verb forms. So Mary drank a beer at the age of 7, right? Mary drank a beer at the age of 7, versus Mary drank beer at the age of 7. There is a different aspectual interpretation here, right? Mary drank a beer at the age of 7 means that she drank a specific beer, right? Like one beer, and it was completed, right? It's very like perfective, right? And that makes sense because drinking a beer is actually it's actually a telic predicate, right? When the beer is gone, the beer has been drunk. Mary drank beer at the age of 7 is a habitual. So all of a sudden, this little word a has made the difference in understanding B as habitual and A as non-habitual. Same verb form, right? All we did was add A or subtract it. And so the point here is that this has nothing to do with the verb form, or it has everything to do with our semantics of A. And this is actually more relevant for Greek and Hebrew, both of which do not have the word A. And if you actually look at the bare singular, so the bare singular in like in B, Mary drank beer, right? That's a bare singular. It's not beers, just there's no article, just singular, and that's it. If you look at the distribution of the bare singular in Greek and Hebrew, it does not mean A. I'll just tell you, like, it does not mean A. And anyone who says like, oh, there's no article here, so it's a whatever and not the, right? That's like a spirit, but not the spirit. That's just like bad logic. It's just it's in languages. You will often have this three-way contrast between indefinite article and definite article, and then bare singular. Some languages just lack indefinite articles, and so the point is that the bare singular is just not the same thing as the indefinite article, as it isn't here, right? A means something important, and here it affects the spectral interpretation. Okay, so
quick question.
Yeah.
When you say B is habitual, would that be imperfective?
Yeah, so it would often be taken to be imperfective because, we don't know whether Mary's drinking, continued past age 7 or not, right? I mean, we would assume that it does, but I should just say that, it's not as much. It's not as important to say like, is this imperfective or not? It's more important to say like, to think through what really does this, like, how do we actually understand this verb form, right? That's what's important here. And what we mean is that Mary had some sort of habit of drinking beer at the age of 7, right? Okay. So enough with English. Now, I hope that all of that discussion, right, you can then take it and apply it to Greek and Hebrew. And so that's kind of what we're going to do now. So let's just look at Greek aspect with achievements. Okay. So why are achievements special, right? an achievement is an event with change but no duration, right? So this is what we have in our Wendler's class system. It's not durative, right? It is telic, right? There is a change. So these are verbs like arrive, break, open. It is dynamic, right? There is change in the world, but they happen instantaneously. Okay. So, what should we expect to happen, right, with achievements, right? This is a problem. If we think about it logically, if we have an event time with no duration, right? So here's our event time, right? Like in perfective and imperfective aspect, here's our event time, right? So it would be fine to put an event time with no duration, like a single point within reference time. Totally fine, right? I mean, we can just and this is how we normally interpret like the past tense in English, right? With achievements, the vase broke, right? Just means that it happened at some instant that the vase broke, right? And so here, reference time extends beyond this point of event time. What we would have a problem with is extending a single point, right, over an interval, right, a reference time. So if we're talking about an interval of time, right, how do we make this single point extend beyond that? So then what we should expect is if a form requires this, right? And so we said that, this is, called imperfective or progressive. I personally would call imperfective like we called the English form, right? It doesn't say anything. It just takes it from the predicate, takes the a spectral value from the predicate. But regardless, like here is this form, right? If a form has this temporal relationship, what's going to happen with achievements, right? Something special is going to happen. So let's just see what happens, right? That's the whole point. So paraginomai is an achievement, right? Arrive. So what we should expect is if the imperfective forms, what are called imperfective, right? So like the present or the imperfect in Greek, if they require this temporal structure, we should expect some sort of usually what's called like coercion. So when I say some in English, when I say I am arriving, or let's say reach, like Mary was reaching the summit, right? So reach is reaching the summit is an achievement, right? There's like an instantaneous like point that she crosses over, or she like ascends to the summit where like, instantaneously, oh, she's there all of a sudden at the summit, right? So Mary was reaching the summit. We really shouldn't allow for that, right? Because the progressive means this. So, and reaching the summit isn't instantaneous. It's just a point. It's just an instantaneous event. So the point is, what happens in our heads when we say Mary was reaching the summit is she actually doesn't reach the summit yet, right? So what we're talking about is we extend the event time to include some sort of like pre-event, right? So Mary is reaching the summit means something like she's about to reach the summit, but she hasn't reached it yet, right? And so we can extend events with with the verb form, right? It can require us to extend events into the past, for example, or into the future, and we can basically be talking about a pre-event time. So that's what we should actually expect if these forms are true imperfectives, right? In that sense. So the question is just, does it happen, right? So I'm going to leave aside tense right now. It's not like super important for our discussion. So in 1, tote paraginetai ho Jesus, apo tes Galileas, epiton Iordanen, prosten Ioannen tu baptistenai ub autu. Okay, so I what I've left out in these translations is our verb, right? So then Jesus blank from Galilee up to the Jordan to John in order to be baptized by him. So this is Matthew 3:13. So the question is for us, so paraginetai is present, right? It's a present form. normally described as imperfective, right? And what people mean by that normally is this, right? The point is that it seems that in this case, when it says, then Jesus blank from Galilee up to the Jordan to John in order to be baptized by him, seems to be pretty much identical to our next in 2, which has an aorist, right? Parageneto de pros auton he meter. And his mother came to him. Sorry, I didn't, or arrived. So I didn't leave out the verb there, or the translation. So the point here is, though, that these are actually identical aspectual interpretations, right? Either way, they're going to a person and they actually arrive, right, at that location. So when Jesus goes from Galilee to the Jordan to John to be baptized by him, he has arrived, right? And that's very clear from the context in Matthew 3:13. He's there, and then he's baptized. The same thing with his mother in Luke 8:19. His mother comes to him. She has arrived, and then she asks a question, right, or whatever. So these spectral interpretations are actually identical, which is not what we would expect, right? Because in English, again, if I said Mary is reaching the summit versus Mary reached the summit, those are not identical, right? One is talking about like a pre-event, and one is talking about the event actually having taken place. Okay, so in both of these, the endpoint is reached. In 1 and 2, right? And so what is the difference? Probably like there's a pragmatic difference between the tense, right? So the difference here is not the aspect, whether or not Jesus or his mother made it to the destination, but it's, in one, the historical present use and whatever that means, which we won't get into, versus the aorist in 2. Okay, so that's the reason why the verb form is used differently, not anything especially different. So there are other facts though, right? So we have other facts like in 3 and 4. Maybe I'll just read. It's 10:30. Maybe I'll read just the translation for the sake of time. And John was there baptizing at Ainon, near Salim, because there was much water there, and so this is a phrase, kai paraginonto, kai ebaptizdonto. So here, the question is, so here we have an imperfect form, and the question is, how is it being interpreted? And again, I'll just read the first part of this next verse, which is from Acts, and I forgot to give the reference. But so just the first part of 4, hoste paragenonto pros auton apen autois. So but when they arrived at him or to him or came to him, he said to them, right? So I think this is the chief leaders coming to Paul. So in 3, the plural has basically what's like a distributive reading. So the idea is that there were multiple people that came at different like coming events and being baptized events, right? So there's this like iteration of like people coming, over and over and over again, right? And so the reason why the imperfect form is used is because you have a plural subject with plural events, right? Whereas in 4, hoste paragenonto, you have a group of people, plural still, right? But you have this sort of like collective interpretation. They all come together, right, in one coming event, and they arrive at Paul, and then he says to them, right? And so here we actually see an aspectual difference between the these two aspects in Greek, right? One allows for a this sort of iterative reading, and then the aorist seems to have this collective reading when we have plural subjects. So if you are thinking about this logically, you should question me, right? And say, well, Kevin, actually 3 doesn't prove that, or 4 doesn't prove that you don't have this iterative reading with the aorist, right? It just proves that you do have a collective reading, right? And so this is something that you would have to check, right? And that I honestly didn't check. So what you would need to check is, in every case with the aorist, do we have this aspectual difference? Like with plural subjects, do we only have this sort of collective reading where they all come together at one time? And again, with the imperfect, do we only have this sort of like iterative or distributive reading where each of the subjects participates in this event, right? That would be the thing to check. Okay, so that's enough with Greek. So let me spend like 10 minutes or so on Hebrew, and then we'll open up for questions. So again, what is the Hebrew participle? People debate about this form. Like some people included it in their system, some people don't. And there's different reasons for that. So the question we can ask is just like, what is it doing aspectually, and how do we figure that out, right? So most people, if you include it in the verbal system, they'll say it's imperfective or progressive, right? That's the normal thing to say. So there's a lot we could do here about the participle, but I just want to give a few examples just so we can see the kinds of things that we need to consider. Okay, so this is Genesis 48:21. This is an example I read in the podcast, but it just shows the aspectual interpretation. Vayoma Yisrael el Yosef, hine anochi met. Okay, so hine anochi met means just behold, I am dying. What's important here is that Israel did not say this while he was dead, right? That's the important point. When he says, I am dying, he means that I am close to dying, right? This is the kind of thing that I discussed earlier with our progressive in English, right? When I say I am dying, it doesn't mean I am dead, right? It means like I'm in some pre-state of dying, or I'm about to die, et cetera, et cetera. All right, it's the same thing with Mary reaching the summit. Okay, so that suggests that the participle, at least in an example like Genesis 48:21, has an aspectual interpretation very much like the progressive, right, in English. This kind of thing is very, very typical of progressives. This sort of like take an achievement, we can talk about a pre-state. Okay. In 2, Diber Sarah al Adonai Elohechem. Sorry, my mouth is like really, really dry, and it's really hard to make guttural sounds. I don't have time to get water, so I'll just keep going. Hamotzi etchem me'eretz Mitzrayim. So the point is here, Hamotzi etchem. He has spoken rebellion against. Let me just read the translation. He has spoken rebellion against Adonai, your God, the one who brought you out from the land of Egypt, right? So here, this seems very, very perfective, right? Hamotzi etchem me'eretz Mitzrayim. The bringing out from the land of Egypt happened in the past, right? This is in Deuteronomy 13:6. It's talking about someone who might, lead Israel astray. And God is someone who did this event, right? He brought them out of Israel. So here it's very, very perfective. So this is a problem, right? Like how do we account for this sort of example with one which, a progressive is very, very different from a perfective. So the issue is, right, in 1, we have an example that suggests it's a progressive, and 2, we have an example that suggests it's a perfective because we know that God actually did bring them out of Egypt. And then in 3, we have another example with Motzi. So Motzi Atzidim Bakashorot. So he leads out prisoners to prosperity. So here again, we see the same kind of thing as we saw with the plural subjects. Here we have plural objects, and we see this sort of thing we saw with people arriving, sort of an iteration of events. All right, he leads out prisoners over and over and over again. So again, this is the kind of evidence, or there's a parallel here, right, to another imperfective form that we've already seen. Okay, so what do we do? In one, I already said endpoint is not reached with an achievement. Pre-state of the predicate occurs. That's very typical. Yeah, that's very similar to English. Okay, so the question is, when we come to examples like this, okay, so what do we do with Deuteronomy 13:6? Why can we use it as seemingly a perfective event? Okay, so the point here is that what we need, the kinds of things we need to consider, especially when we're dealing with things like participles, is other sorts of like syntactic, or basically the syntactic environment. So what's different between these two predicates here, 1 and 2? The definite article, right? The definite article is found in 1, not found in 2. Okay, and we know, you should know, or if you don't know, it's okay, that participles in Hebrew can behave in different ways. Some are nominal, some can just be, they can just act like a noun, and like syntactically. Others can act like verbs, and other times they can act like an adjective, right? So the idea is that if we have an example like 1, the question is this a problem for us saying that the verb form is progressive, right, or imperfective? Not if there is a different syntactic environment where this is found, and we can say that it loses its aspectual interpretation for a good reason, right? Because it is used as a noun and not as a verb, right? So this is the whole point, is that you have to pay careful attention to not just what the verb form is doing, right, but also to where the verb form is found and what is its syntactic environment. So if we just say, hey, 1 is actually not parallel to 1 here, right, is not parallel to Kine Anochi Met, right, because we have the definite article, then it solves our problem, right? One might say then, well, what about etchem, right? What about this definite article? Sorry, not definite article, direct object, right? How do you account for the fact? Don't verbs normally take direct objects? So again, this is something that we should include in our analysis, and the way we would prove this one way or the other would be to see if nouns are found with direct objects as well. And in fact, in biblical Hebrew, they are. So nominalizations, nouns formed from verbs are found with et in Hebrew. And I left out the reference here. There's an example in Micah. But there's plenty of examples, which just shows again, right, that we need to be careful, like again, in how we do our analysis, right? We need to be careful about all the different elements that are in play. So I can't just say et, takes requires a verb, right? That's something that's a claim that needs to be checked, right? And it turns out in Hebrew, there are plenty of nouns that take et as direct objects. Okay, so that, hopefully, I know that was like a lot, and we ran through it very quickly, but I hope that you got a sort of like feeling for the kinds of things you should be looking for when you're doing analyses. It's not that important that you got all the details, right? What's important is that you begin to think like someone doing semantics, because honestly, there are a lot of people in the field that are doing analyses on the biblical languages, but they haven't taken like an intro to semantics class, like in the linguistics department, just people doing semantics. And there's a certain way you go about doing that. And I think, so hopefully this will have helped you, get a feel for what you actually need to do when you tackle some of these problems. So let's just open it up at this point. If anyone has questions, specific questions, about anything I said, or specific questions about the verbal systems, you can ask me, really anything you want. If you have a verse, you're like, I don't know what to do with this, or just like general big picture questions, everything's fair game.
Kevin, are you aware of any introductory grammars in both Greek and Hebrew that do a good job with all of this? A lot of the ones, even very recent ones, they are beginning to mention these things, but they don't actually teach the language that way. Even when they mention it, they basically just say this exists, and then they move on as if it didn't exist.
Yeah. Yeah, honestly, I really don't. I can tell you that there are like real, I don't want to say, let me just say, okay, I'm not like interested in like picking a fight, and like I don't really, yeah, I like want to be, kind to other people's work and stuff. I would just say that like most people haven't, just aren't in the linguistics literature. So that's just like the facts that most people in biblical studies study biblical studies, and they're just not enough. They just don't dive deep enough in the linguistics literature. So there are people that have done. There are people, from the field of linguistics, especially in Greek studies, that have done studies on ancient Greek, especially the verbal system. What I would do, it would be to read just like an introductory semantics textbook and just think about Greek with it, or Hebrew. So the one that I normally recommend is Analyzing Meaning by Paul Krager. It's free online. And it will give you solid categories to start to analyze these things. But as far as like an introductory textbook, I really don't know of one that would explain these kinds of things. I mean, this is something that we are working on, but I don't know of one right now.
No, that's good. Analyzing Meaning by Paul Krager.
Yeah.
Thank you.
That's I think it's Kreoger, but I always you might need to flip the E and the O, but yeah.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So maybe it'll take longer to answer, I don't know, but based on, hopefully it doesn't, but so I kind of want to apply this to the world of theology. So for a couple of denominations and such, they subscribe to what's called like a crisis experience, so to speak, like a second experience of the Holy Spirit. And a critical aspect of their argumentation is a certain understanding of the aorist tense form, aorist tense. So with a more robust understanding, kind of based in actual linguistics of tense aspect and actio and start and such, I'm curious how you might respond to arguments such as like in Romans 12:1 and Romans 6:13, I think it is, says they'll pretty much say like, just present yourself this one time, put to death the sins of the flesh, like those kinds of things. They would say, okay, so that because the aorist is used, it has to refer to this one point in time, and therefore refers to this crisis decisive experience in which you surrender yourself fully to God and you have a second experience of the Holy Spirit, because why would Paul say that if these people were already Christians? So I'm curious how this might factor into that kind of theological argument.
Yeah, so I would just say that the aorist doesn't mean that, right? Like most of the time, like the issue is that people are far too simplistic with the categories, right? Just like by and large, like people That's what people do. So the issue is that the aorist says, right, that the way we've defined aorist, right, and even like the idea of the perfective. I mean, there are again like you'd have to look at it in a specific language, right, and see what it's doing. But we can think of perfectivity in different ways, right? So, for example, we can think of habitual perfectives, right? So a habitual perfective would be something like I went to the store every Sunday from like when I was young, right? I went to the store every Sunday when I was young. So in this case, right, we have when I go to the store every Sunday, I make it to the store, right? I like that event like reaches its endpoint every single Sunday for a long period of time in like when I was young, right? So the point is each individual event in that in that habit is perfective, right? It comes to an end. So my point would be, and I'm not speaking like I wouldn't be willing to answer the question like outright, right? Like what I would do is I would look at the context and I would say like, what is this verb form doing, across all contexts, right? What is this particular verb doing, right? So put to death, right? One of the issues would be that when you put something like the issue is not so much with the aorist here, it's with the putting to death, right? Like, is that an event that we can iterate, right? If it's an event we can iterate, then and we put it with a perfective, we can definitely say, basically what you have to do is you have to put it all the way to death one day, let's put it all the way to death another day, all the way to death the next day, right? And we can think of this sort of scenario, right? Take up your cross daily and follow me, right? That's a very similar thing, right? When you take up your cross, it's not like you have to like actually take it up, right? That's like perfective in that sense. And I'm not even sure what verb form is used there. But the point I would just say is it is theologically significant right here. I mean, this is but I would just say that the aorist does not exclude the possibility of habituality, right? Like perfective forms just do not do that. Like if you just look at cross-linguistically, that's just not what they're saying. So what you would expect is if the reference time, what's important is the reference time here. So if the reference time is talking about an extended period of time, then what you would expect with the aorist and habitual would be you are doing that action to its completion over and over and over again, right? That would be the idea. That's not to say that interpretation is correct, right? Again, like I wouldn't be willing to say it until I like sat down and really looked at the passage. But it is to say that there, I wouldn't say it's just a matter of this is what the aorist means. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, no, that's helpful. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I have a question about the collecting of data and interpreting it, and this may be a very basic question in semantics. So when you're working with English, you can speak to native speakers and say, what does this mean to you? But when you're working in, say, Hebrew and Greek, I understand how you can collect evidence by, for example, collocations. But then if what you're trying to figure out is what this verb form can mean, how do you know what your examples mean?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, this is a huge problem, right? So what, I mean, we have a unique task, right? And this is true of all historical linguistics, not just Hebrew and Greek, right? It's true of Shakespeare. Like if you're going to study Shakespeare, we don't have native speakers of, Shakespeare in English that would like much more intuitively understand like, exactly what Shakespeare would mean in a certain context. So what I would suggest, and I didn't, say this, but I probably should have, would be to start with the data that is more secure, right? And so this is one of the reasons why, for example, like Stuart, why I wouldn't start with theologically, loaded passages, right? Because everyone has opinions on it and everyone has their interpretation, and their interpretation is right regardless of what the text says, right? I mean, I say that kiddingly, but really, like if we start with those kinds of examples, then it's much harder to build a theory. So the point is, like, let's start with things that seem to be very clear from the context, right? So for example, when I gave the example with Jesus coming to be baptized, right? And so we can know from the context, the like what happens later in the story, right? So Jesus is coming, right? And to be baptized, and then he actually is there and is baptized, right? So we know that he actually did arrive, right? And he then was subsequently baptized. So the point is that we can use context, just in the same way that we did with English, where I would say something like, Mary was at the store, and I said, well, we can construct the context, right, where we understand that to mean, something like Mary was just at the store for a set amount of time, or Mary was at the store and we don't know if she's still there or not, right? So the way that we the different ways that we can understand those verbs are based on our building of context. So the idea would be that what you have to do in Hebrew and Greek is pay very, very careful attention to the context and what sorts of meanings are allowed from the context, and then kind of like, quote unquote, rank, right, these sorts of interpretations. So we can say, like, okay, these like examples are very, very firm. We have very clear examples of people like there's no other way to interpret this given the context other than this interpretation. And then we take those examples and then we say, how then can we think about the interpretations that are much more fuzzy, right? Where we're not really sure about, the context doesn't lead us to say something definitive. So that's what I would say. I mean, and I will say it really is a problem just for historical linguistics in general, and it's not an insurmountable problem, but it is, I think it is a like something that should make us have a fair degree of humility in our analyses, right? Because at the end of the day, we're not native speakers, and so I, as a native speaker, can just say, like, I don't accept that sentence in English, and like, I'm right most of the time. But that's not true of English. I mean of Greek and Hebrew, right? So yeah, great question. Sorry, I just kind of started rambling on that, but
no, that's terrific. Thank you.
Yeah. Anything else?
Just a quick note. I put in the chat some of the recommended readings, Kevin, that you have recommended on some of our recent podcast episodes. And then I also dropped the links to those episodes where you can see the recommended readings in the show notes. So if people want some recommended readings, you can see those in the chat.
Oh. Good job, Nick.
Thanks.
Anything else? Any other questions?
I think I'd just like to ask about what you've spoken about in terms of Bible translation. Has some of the updates in linguistics affected some of the revisions? Might be quite a broad question, but I'd just be interested to see how that's interacted.
In Greek or Hebrew or both?
As you wish.
So I would say, so it's really interesting. So the Bible translation field is, they are interested in linguistics, but they're not as interested in the biblical languages normally.
Right.
And one of the really big issues is that, like, they normally know linguistics better than the people doing biblical studies, but because they normally don't know Greek or Hebrew, they normally take the analyses from biblical studies people, right, and just appropriate them.
Run with
So yeah, exactly. So honestly, I think there's a lot of work that needs to be done in this area. You know, someone like Paul Krager, like, he was my teacher. Like, he wrote the book I recommended. He was my teacher at GIL or DIU, where I got my master's. And, you know, I wrote my thesis on the verbal system of biblical Hebrew. And, you know, he doesn't know Hebrew or Greek. And he doesn't, I mean, he's interested, right? But he's like, he can't really speak into those languages because he doesn't know them, right? He's a great linguist. I mean, and he's well respected in the linguistics field in general. He really is. But because there aren't more people like that, it's hard, you know, that are straddling the worlds, right? It's hard for it really to make inroads in the Bible translation world. Yeah, I mean, there are people doing it, but yeah, like I said, I think there's still a lot of work that needs to be done still.
It's interesting. Thank you.
Yep.
Seems like it would be a difficult thing to do because, I mean, kind of getting a depth of linguistics and biblical studies, those are both things you can spend the rest of your life doing, and then some.
Yeah.
So kind of, you need that partnership, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, yeah, that's what I'm trying to do, so I understand why people don't do it. But I do think it's really important.
Right.
So you're beginning to start doing it. How do we analyze that verb?
Yeah. See. Once you open up this, like, can of worms, then you just, like, ruin yourself. You know, like, everything you say is just something to be analyzed. And yeah.
It's really interesting. My head was going to all sorts of different places. I'm thinking about the creation moment, because that was simultaneous between God's decree and then creation happening. So what do I think about that now? And
yeah. For sure.
So thank you very much for enlightening me.
It looks like Dave had the side point. Some challenge in Bible translation is unfortunately the business side of a translated text. Into a well-known verse, make sure you feel it wrong. Yes, for sure. So just it's a huge point. I mean, you can, for example, the KJV has absolutely influenced every single English translation after it, just necessarily, because if you change it, you know, people have just gotten upset. So it's just not changed, even if we have progressed since 1611 in our understanding of Greek and Hebrew, right? And we have, I mean, genuinely. All that to say, a lot of those guys were probably better just at the language than a lot of people today. Just they were, I think they were very good at the languages. Anything else? Well,
I think
go ahead.
I would say I think another issue, and this goes to what you were saying before, that generally the people that are good at the biblical languages are not so good at the linguistics, and linguists don't know the biblical languages. But another issue is that linguists also, and even you were even experiencing this as you were trying to give us an overview, is that almost every single thing you were saying has 18 different meanings, you know, and 14 different schools and 93 different interpretations and so forth, the same exact words. And so you're like, well, you know, what exactly do you mean by that? I mean, even what ought to be simple things like perfective and imperfective don't always mean perfective and imperfective. They're just used differently by different people. So Makes
I
it
will
hard to grasp the whole
for
field.
sure, for sure. I will say that I mean, linguistics is a field that is like notorious for like a lot of terminology, a lot of like complex terminology, um, and sometimes different definitions of that terminology. I will say that if you are in the field, it's not nearly as messy as it may seem from outside. Like the nuances that we're talking about with like imperfective, for example, are are nuances, right? So they really are like, you know, when we present it, the issue is that like when Nora and I had that conversation, for example, you know, like we're talking for 50 minutes about you know, a topic that there are classes taught on, you know. So the issue is that you just, you know, when you talk about it, and this is part of the problem, right, is that within biblical studies, because like if people have read in linguistics, it's the basics, right? And then they take the basics, and it is an oversimplified version of, you know, the field, and then they just like plop it onto biblical studies, and they don't really realize that like actually it's more complex, right? And there are nuanced differences that people are discussing within linguistics, that would affect your analysis, right? That's the issue. So I do agree with you, and I think it's a big problem. And I think that's one of the reasons why people just don't get into linguistics, right? That is the reason, right? It's tough to get into, a lot of terminology, it's just a big barrier to entry. And then we're like, what's the payoff, right? But that being said, I do think that if you know, if you are in that field, it isn't nearly as like, you know, everyone disagrees with everyone, right? There are like genuine, you know, points of agreement, and then what we're doing is like small refinements to take into account more data, right? And that does change our definition, right? But it's just in very subtle ways. Yeah, but I hear you, and it's a bummer that it's like that.
Well, I do appreciate the way that you introduced it to us today, because your focus was, okay, the bare minimum of technology, just so that of terminology, just so that you know what I'm talking about when I'm talking about something. And then basically you were getting us focused on asking the right questions about what's actually going on with the language, regardless of what language it is, what's going on with the language, how is it actually being used. And that's where the good part about this, that's harder in linguistics, the good part about this for us is that we're dealing with a fixed corpus of literature. And so it's, you know, we don't have to deal with all of language as living and still changing and moving and breathing and, you know, slang and kids and all. We don't have to deal with all that. It's just, you know, a text, or at least, and it's a text over a large period of time, but still it's a fixed body of literature that we're dealing with. So that helps.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it's way harder to deal with, you know, something like English, where it's like so many different varieties, and yeah, I mean, it's harder and it's not, right? It's just different. But yeah, and that's what I hope that you guys get from this is going back to the text and asking the right questions, right? At the end of the day, like, you know, you're not gonna, an hour and a half is not enough to make you a linguist, right? It might be enough to help you not make mistakes, right? Make just like simple mistakes that people will make just because they don't understand the method on like how you go about doing semantics.
Can I ask Kevin just the relationship between biblical scholars and linguists, and where that sits along the theological spectrum in terms of liberal or conservative, however you want to use those terms? But is it the case that there are less conservative scholars that are versed in linguistics and the biblical languages, or are the ones that are more proficient in linguistics tending to be more liberal in on the theological spectrum? Is it equal? You know, because in my mind, I'm thinking about like James Barr and what he did trying to bring linguistics to biblical studies. There was that kind of other aspect of his beliefs there.
Yeah. So, I mean, you know, I think today, I mean, obviously James Barr is just, you know, not as relevant for like modern scholarship, right?
Yeah.
Like in the modern landscape, I think today, like the people doing linguistics, like really is, I mean, it's really not dependent on, it doesn't divide on the the conservative liberal spectrum. I mean, I think people in general are starting to realize more and more that, you know, we obviously like the biblical languages are important. I mean, I think there's been a shift, right, from like in general theology to biblical studies and exegesis, right? Like there's just been this sort of like, okay, we really need to take into account like what the text is really saying, and how that's fit into their world, and then move from that to theology, right? And really dig into the text. And then from that, right, obviously like the next question is like, okay, well then we need a theory of language to interpret Greek and Hebrew, right? And so I think that has just led some people to linguistics as that theory of language. And so I don't think it is, you know, divided in that way. But yeah, I mean, I can think of, you know, people from all of the spectrum that are trying to use it. So. Anything else? Well, I'm gonna go to bed. It's past my bedtime. So here in Israel, it's 11:10. So I really appreciate all of you guys for coming out. And yeah, I think we'll probably post this, Nick, I assume, somewhere.
Yeah, we will. And I can email everyone since I know obviously everyone that registered for this. So I'll send it out.
Yeah. So thanks for coming. Thanks for your questions. And feel free to reach out if you do have any other questions to one of us, and we will keep the conversation going. So
thank you.
Thank you. This was fantastic.